Chapter 11 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The incidents of the days that followed, relating as they did peculiarly to Jennie, were of an order which the morality of our day has agreed to taboo. Certain processes of the All-Mother, the great artificing wisdom of the power that works and weaves in silence and in darkness, when viewed in the light of the established opinion of some of the little individuals created by it, are considered very vile. We turn our faces away from the creation of life as if that were the last thing that man should dare to interest himself in openly. It is curious that a feeling of this sort should spring up in a world whose very essence is generative. The vast process dual, and where wind, water, soil, and light alike minister to the fruition of that which is all that we are. Although the whole earth, not we alone, is moved by passions hymeneal, and everything terrestrial has come into being by the one common road, yet there is that ridiculous tendency to close the eyes and turn away the head, as if there was something unclean in nature itself. Conceived in iniquity and born in sin, is the unnatural interpretation put upon the process by the extreme religionist, and the world, by its silence, gives assent to a judgment so marvelously warped. Surely there is something radically wrong in this attitude. The teachings of philosophy and the deductions of biology should find more practical application in the daily reasoning of man. No process is vile, no condition is unnatural. The accidental variation from a given social practice does not necessarily entail sin. No poor little earthling, caught in the enormous grip of chance and so swerved from the established custom of men, could possibly be guilty of that depth of vileness which the attitude of the world would seem to predicate so inevitably. Jennie was now to witness this unjust interpretation of that wonder of nature which, but for Brander's death, might have been consecrated and hallowed as one of the ideal functions of life. Although herself unable to distinguish the separateness of this from every other normal process of life, yet she was made to feel by the actions of all about her that degradation was her portion, and sin the foundation as well as the condition of her state. Almost, not quite, it was sought to extinguish the affection, the consideration, the care which afterward the world would demand of her for her child. Almost, not quite, was the budding and essential love looked upon as evil. Although her punishment was neither the gibbet nor the jail of a few hundred years before, yet the ignorance and immobility of the human beings about her made it impossible for them to see anything in her present condition but a vile and premeditated infraction of the social code, the punishment of which was ostracism. All she could do now was to shun the scornful gaze of men and to bear in silence the great change that was coming upon her. Strangely enough, she felt no useless remorse, no vain regrets. Her heart was pure, and she was conscious that it was filled with peace. Sorrow there was, it is true, but only a mellow phase of it, a vague uncertainty and wonder which would sometimes cause her eyes to fill with tears. You have heard the wood dove calling in the lone stillness of the summertime. You have found the unheeded brooklet singing and babbling where no ear comes to hear. Under dead leaves and snowbanks the delicate arbutus unfolds its simple blossom, answering some heavenly call for color. So, too, this other flower of womanhood. Jennie was left alone, but, like the wood dove, she was a voice of sweetness in the summertime. Going about her household duties, she was content to wait, without a murmur, the fulfillment of that process for which, after all, she was but the sacrificial implement. When her duties were lightest, she was content to sit in quiet meditation, the marvel of life holding her as in a trance. When she was hardest pressed to aid her mother, she would sometimes find herself quietly singing, the pleasure of work lifting her out of herself. Always she was content to face the future with a serene and unfaltering courage. It is not so with all women. Nature is unkind in permitting the minor type to bear a child at all. The larger natures in their maturity welcome motherhood, see in it the immense possibilities of racial fulfillment, and find joy and satisfaction in being the handmaiden of so immense a purpose. Jennie, a child in years, was potentially a woman physically and mentally, but not yet come into rounded conclusions as to life and her place in it. The great situation which had forced her into this anomalous position was, from one point of view, a tribute to her individual capacity. It proved her courage, the largeness of her sympathy, her willingness to sacrifice for what she considered a worthy cause. That it resulted in an unexpected consequence which placed upon her a larger and more complicated burden was due to the fact that her sense of self-protection had not been commensurate with her emotions. There were times when the prospective coming of the child gave her a sense of fear and confusion, because she did not know but that the child might eventually reproach her. But there was always that saving sense of eternal justice in life which would not permit her to be utterly crushed. To her way of thinking, people were not intentionally cruel. Vague thoughts of sympathy and divine goodness permeated her soul. Life at worst or best was beautiful, had always been so. These thoughts did not come to her all at once, but through the months during which she watched and waited. It was a wonderful thing to be a mother, even under these untoward conditions. She felt that she would love this child, would be a good mother to it, if life permitted. That was the problem. What would life permit? There were many things to be done, clothes to be made, certain provisions of hygiene and diet to be observed. One of her fears was that Gerhardt might unexpectedly return, but he did not. The old family doctor, who had nursed the various members of the Gerhardt family through their multitudinous ailments, Dr. Ellwanger, was taken into consultation, and he gave sound and practical advice. Despite his Lutheran upbringing, the practice of medicine in a large and kindly way had led him to the conclusion that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophies and in our small neighborhood relationships. So it is, he observed to Mrs. Gerhardt, when she confided to him nervously what the trouble was. Well, you mustn't worry. These things happen in more places than you think. If you knew as much about life as I do, and about your neighbors, you would not cry. Your girl will be all right. She is very healthy. She can go away somewhere afterward, and people will never know. Why should you worry about what your neighbors think? It is not so uncommon as you imagine. Mrs. Gerhardt marveled. He was such a wise man. It gave her a little courage. As for Jennie, she listened to his advice with interest and without fear. She wanted things not so much for herself as for her child, and she was anxious to do whatever she was told. The doctor was curious to know who the father was. When informed, he lifted his eyes. Indeed, he commented, that ought to be a bright baby. There came the final hour when the child was ushered into the world. It was Dr. Ellwanger who presided, assisted by the mother, who, having brought forth 6 herself, knew exactly what to do. There was no difficulty, and at the first cry of the newborn infant there awakened in Jennie a tremendous yearning toward it. This was her child. It was weak and feeble, a little girl, and it needed her care. She took it to her breast when it had been bathed and swaddled with a tremendous sense of satisfaction and joy. This was her child, her little girl. She wanted to live to be able to work for it, and rejoiced even in her weakness that she was so strong. Dr. Ellwanger predicted a quick recovery. He thought 2 weeks would be the outside limit of her need to stay in bed. As a matter of fact, in 10 days she was up and about, as vigorous and healthy as ever. She had been born with strength and with that nurturing quality which makes the ideal mother. The great crisis had passed, and now life went on much as before. The children, outside of Bass, were too young to understand fully, and had been deceived by the story that Jennie was married to Senator Brander, who had died. They did not know that a child was coming until it was there. The neighbors were feared by Mrs. Gerhardt, for they were ever watchful and really knew all. Jennie would never have braved this local atmosphere except for the advice of Bass, who, having secured a place in Cleveland some time before, had written that he thought when she was well enough it would be advisable for the whole family to seek a new start in Cleveland. Things were flourishing there. Once away, they would never hear of their present neighbors, and Jennie could find something to do. So she stayed at home. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bass was no sooner in Cleveland than the marvel of that growing city was sufficient to completely restore his equanimity of soul and to stir up new illusions as to the possibility of rehabilitation for himself and his family. If only they could come here, he thought. If only they could all get work and do right. Here was no evidence of any of their recent troubles, no acquaintances who could suggest by their mere presence the troubles of the past. All was business, all activity. The very turning of the corner seemed to rid one of old times and crimes. It was as if a new world existed in every block. He soon found a place in a cigar store, and after working a few weeks he began to write home the cheering ideas he had in mind. Jennie ought to come as soon as she was able, and then, if she found something to do, the others might follow. There was plenty of work for girls of her age. She could live in the same house with him temporarily, or maybe they could take one of the $15 a month cottages that were for rent. There were big general furnishing houses where one could buy everything needful for a small house on very easy monthly terms. His mother could come and keep house for them. They would be in a clean, new atmosphere, unknown and untalked about. They could start life all over again. They could be decent, honorable, prosperous. Filled with this hope and the glamour which new scenes and new environment invariably throw over the unsophisticated mind, he wrote a final letter, in which he suggested that Jennie should come at once. This was when the baby was 6 months old. There were theaters here, he said, and beautiful streets. Vessels from the lakes came into the heart of the city. It was a wonderful city, and growing very fast. It was thus that the new life appealed to him. The effect which all of this had upon Mrs. Gerhardt, Jennie, and the rest of the family was phenomenal. Mrs. Gerhardt, long weighed upon by the misery which Jennie's error had entailed, was for taking measures for carrying out this plan at once. So buoyant was her natural temperament that she was completely carried away by the glory of Cleveland, and already saw fulfilled therein not only her own desires for a nice home, but the prosperous advancement of her children. Of course they could get work, she said. Bass was right. She had always wanted Gerhardt to go to some large city, but he would not. Now it was necessary, and they would go and become better off than they had ever been. And Gerhardt did take this view of the situation. In answer to his wife's letter, he wrote that it was not advisable for him to leave his place, but if Bass saw a way for them, it might be a good thing to go. He was the more ready to acquiesce in the plan for the simple reason that he was half distracted with the worry of supporting the family and of paying the debts already outstanding. Every week he laid by $5 out of his salary, which he sent in the form of a postal order to Mrs. Gerhardt. $3 he paid for board, and 50 cents he kept for spending money, church dues, a little tobacco, and occasionally a glass of beer. Every week he put $1.50 in a little iron bank against a rainy day. His room was a bare corner in the topmost loft of the mill. To this he would ascend after sitting alone on the doorstep of the mill in this lonely, forsaken neighborhood until 9 o'clock of an evening, and here, amid the odor of machinery wafted up from the floor below, by the light of a single tallow candle, he would conclude his solitary day, reading his German paper, folding his hands and thinking, kneeling by an open window in the shadow of the night to say his prayers, and silently stretching himself to rest. Long were the days, dreary the prospect. Still he lifted his hands in utmost faith to God, praying that his sins might be forgiven and that he might be vouchsafed a few more years of comfort and of happy family life. So the momentous question was finally decided. There was the greatest longing and impatience among the children. Mrs. Gerhardt shared their emotions in a suppressed way. Jennie was to go first, as Bass had suggested. Later on they would all follow. When the hour came for Jennie's departure, there was great excitement in the household. "How long you going to be 'fore you send for us?" was Martha's inquiry, several times repeated. "Tell Bass to hurry up," said the eager George. "I want to go to Cleveland. I want to go to Cleveland." Veronica was caught singing to herself. "Listen to her!" exclaimed George sarcastically. "Aw, you hush up," was her displeased rejoinder. When the final hour came, however, it required all of Jennie's strength to go through with the farewells. Though everything was being done in order to bring them together again under better conditions, she could not help feeling depressed. Her little one, now 6 months old, was being left behind. The great world was to her one undiscovered bourne. It frightened her. "You mustn't worry, Ma," she found courage enough to say. "I'll be all right. I'll write you just as soon as I get there. It won't be very long." But when it came to bending over the baby for the last time, her courage went out like a blown lamp. Stooping over the cradle in which the little one was resting, she looked into its face with passionate motherly yearning. "Is it going to be a good little girl?" she cooed. Then she caught it up into her arms, and hugging it closely to her neck and bosom, she buried her face against its little body. Mrs. Gerhardt saw that she was trembling. "Come now," she said coaxingly. "You mustn't carry on so. She will be all right with me. I'll take care of her. If you're going to act this way, you'd better not try to go at all." Jennie lifted her head, her blue eyes wet with tears, and handed the little one to her mother. "I can't help it," she said, half crying, half smiling. Quickly she kissed her mother and the children. Then she hurried out. As she went down the street with George, she looked back and bravely waved her hand. Mrs. Gerhardt responded, noticing how much more like a woman she looked. It had been necessary to invest some money in new clothes to wear on the train. She had selected a neat, ready-made suit of brown, which fitted her nicely. She wore the skirt of this with a white shirt-waist, and a sailor hat with a white veil wound round it in such fashion that it could be easily drawn over her face. As she went farther and farther away, Mrs. Gerhardt followed her lovingly with her glance, and when she disappeared from view, she said tenderly, through her own tears, "I'm glad she looks so nice, anyhow." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This recording is in the public domain. Bass met Jennie at the depot in Cleveland and talked hopefully of the prospects. "The first thing is to get work," he began, while the jingling sounds and the changing odors which the city thrust upon her were confusing and almost benumbing her senses. "Get something to do. It doesn't matter what, so long as you get something. If you don't get more than $3 or $4 a week, it will pay the rent. Then, with what George can earn when he comes, and what Pop sends, we can get along all right. It'll be better than being down in that hole," he concluded. "Yes," said Jennie vaguely, her mind so hypnotized by the new display of life about her that she could not bring it forcibly to bear upon the topic under discussion. "I know what you mean. I'll get something." She was much older now in understanding, if not in years. The ordeal through which she had so recently passed had aroused in her a clearer conception of the responsibilities of life. Her mother was always in her mind, her mother and the children. In particular, Martha and Veronica must have a better opportunity to do for themselves than she had had. They should be dressed better. They ought to be kept longer in school. They must have more companionship, more opportunity to broaden their lives. Cleveland, like every other growing city at this time, was crowded with those who were seeking employment. New enterprises were constantly springing up, but those who were seeking to fulfill the duties they provided were invariably in excess of the demand. A stranger coming into the city might walk into a small position of almost any kind on the very day he arrived, and he might as readily wander in search of employment for weeks and even months. Bass suggested the shops and department stores as the first field in which to inquire. The factories and other avenues of employment were to be her second choice. "Don't pass a place, though," he had cautioned her. "If you think there's any chance of getting anything to do, go right in." "What must I say?" asked Jennie nervously. "Tell them you want work. You don't care what you do to begin with." In compliance with this advice, Jennie set out the very first day and was rewarded by some very chilly experiences. Wherever she went, no one seemed to want any help. She applied at the stores, the factories, the little shops that lined the outlying thoroughfares, but was always met by a rebuff. As a last resort, she turned to housework, although she had hoped to avoid that, and studying the want columns, she selected 4 which seemed more promising than the others. To these she decided to apply. One had already been filled when she arrived, but the lady who came to the door was so taken by her appearance that she invited her in and questioned her as to her ability. "I wish you had come a little earlier," she said. "I like you better than I do the girl I have taken. Leave me your address, anyhow." Jennie went away smiling at her reception. She was not quite so youthful looking as she had been before her recent trouble, but her thinner cheeks and the slightly deeper eyes added to the pensiveness and delicacy of her countenance. She was a model of neatness. Her clothes, all neatly cleaned and ironed before leaving home, gave her a fresh and inviting appearance. There was growth coming to her in the matter of height, but already in appearance and intelligence she looked to be a young woman of 20. Best of all, she was of that naturally sunny disposition which, in spite of toil and privation, kept her always cheerful. Anyone in need of a servant girl or house companion would have been delighted to have had her. The second place at which she applied was a large residence in Euclid Avenue. It seemed far too imposing for anything she might have to offer in the way of services, but having come so far, she decided to make the attempt. The servant who met her at the door directed her to wait a few moments, and finally ushered her into the boudoir of the mistress of the house on the second floor. The latter, a Mrs. Bracebridge, a prepossessing brunette of the conventionally fashionable type, had a keen eye for feminine values and was impressed rather favorably with Jennie. She talked with her a little while and finally decided to try her in the general capacity of maid. "I will give you $4 a week, and you can sleep here if you wish," said Mrs. Bracebridge. Jennie explained that she was living with her brother and would soon have her family with her. "Oh, very well," replied her mistress. "Do as you like about that, only I expect you to be here promptly." She wished her to remain for the day and to begin her duties at once, and Jennie agreed. Mrs. Bracebridge provided her a dainty cap and apron, and then spent some little time in instructing her in her duties. Her principal work would be to wait on her mistress, to brush her hair and help her dress. She was also to answer the bell, wait on the table if need be, and do any other errand which her mistress might indicate. Mrs. Bracebridge seemed a little hard and formal to her prospective servant, but for all that Jennie admired the dash and go and the obvious executive capacity of her employer. At 8 o'clock that evening Jennie was dismissed for the day. She wondered if she could be of any use in such a household, and marveled that she had got along as well as she had. Her mistress had set her to cleaning her jewelry and boudoir ornaments as an opening task, and though she had worked steadily and diligently, she had not finished by the time she left. She hurried away to her brother's apartment, delighted to be able to report that she had found a situation. Now her mother could come to Cleveland. Now she could have her baby with her. Now they could really begin that new life which was to be so much better and finer and sweeter than anything they had ever had before. At Bass's suggestion, Jennie wrote her mother to come at once, and a week or so later a suitable house was found and rented. Mrs. Gerhardt, with the aid of the children, packed up the simple belongings of the family, including a single van-load of furniture, and at the end of a fortnight they were on their way to the new home. Mrs. Gerhardt always had had a keen desire for a really comfortable home. Solid furniture, upholstered and trimmed, a thick, soft carpet of some warm, pleasing color, plenty of chairs, settees, pictures, a lounge, and a piano. She had wanted these nice things all her life, but her circumstances had never been good enough for her hopes to be realized. Still, she did not despair. Some day, maybe, before she died, these things would be added to her, and she would be happy. Perhaps her chance was coming now. Arrived at Cleveland, this feeling of optimism was encouraged by the sight of Jennie's cheerful face. Bass assured her that they would get along all right. He took them out to the house, and George was shown the way to go back to the depot and have the freight looked after. Mrs. Gerhardt had still $50 left out of the money which Senator Brander had sent to Jennie, and with this a way of getting a little extra furniture on the installment plan was provided. Bass had already paid the first month's rent, and Jennie had spent her evenings for the last few days in washing the windows and floors of this new house and getting it into a state of perfect cleanliness. Now, when the first night fell, they had 2 new mattresses and comfortable spreads upon a clean floor, a new lamp purchased from one of the nearby stores, a single box borrowed by Jennie from a grocery store for cleaning purposes upon which Mrs. Gerhardt could sit, and some sausages and bread to stay them until morning. They talked and planned for the future until 9 o'clock came, when all but Jennie and her mother retired. These two talked on, the burden of responsibilities resting on the daughter. Mrs. Gerhardt had come to feel in a way dependent upon her. In the course of a week the entire cottage was in order, with a half a dozen pieces of new furniture, a new carpet, and some necessary kitchen utensils. The most disturbing thing was the need of a new cooking stove, the cost of which added greatly to the bill. The younger children were entered at the public school, but it was decided that George must find some employment. Both Jennie and her mother felt the injustice of this keenly, but knew no way of preventing the sacrifice. "We'll let him go to school next year if we can," said Jennie. Auspiciously as the new life seemed to have begun, the closeness with which their expenses were matching their income was an ever-present menace. Bass, originally very generous in his propositions, soon announced that he felt $4 a week for his room and board to be a sufficient contribution from himself. Jennie gave everything she earned, and protested that she did not stand in need of anything so long as the baby was properly taken care of. George secured a place as an overgrown cash boy and brought in $2.50 a week, all of which at first he gladly contributed. Later on he was allowed the 50 cents for himself as being meet and just. Gerhardt, from his lonely post of labor, contributed $5 by mail, always arguing that a little money ought to be saved in order that his honest debts back in Columbus might be paid. Out of this total income of $15 a week, all of these individuals had to be fed and clothed, the rent paid, coal purchased, and the regular monthly installment of $3 paid on the outstanding furniture bill of $50. How it was done, those comfortable individuals who frequently discussed the social aspects of poverty might well trouble to inform themselves. Rent, coal, and light alone consumed the goodly sum of $20 a month. Food, another unfortunate necessary item, used up 25 more. Clothes, installments, dues, occasional items of medicine, and the like were met out of the remaining $11. How? The ardent imagination of the comfortable reader can guess. It was done, however, and for a time the hopeful members considered that they were doing fairly well. During this period the little family presented a picture of honorable and patient toil, which was interesting to contemplate. Every day Mrs. Gerhardt, who worked like a servant and who received absolutely no compensation, either in clothes, amusements, or anything else, arose in the morning while the others slept and built the fire. Then she took up the task of getting the breakfast. Often, as she moved about noiselessly in her thin, worn slippers, cushioned with pieces of newspaper to make them fit, she looked in on Jennie, Bass, and George, wrapped in their heavy slumbers, and with that divine sympathy which is born in heaven, she wished that they did not need to rise so early or to work so hard. Sometimes she would pause before touching her beloved Jennie, gaze at her white face so calm in sleep, and lament that life had not dealt more kindly with her. Then she would lay her hand gently upon her shoulder and whisper, "Jennie, Jennie," until the weary sleeper would wake. When they arose, breakfast was always ready. When they returned at night, supper was waiting. Each of the children received a due share of Mrs. Gerhardt's attention. The little baby was closely looked after by her. She protested that she needed neither clothes nor shoes so long as one of the children would run errands for her. Jennie, of all the children, fully understood her mother. She alone strove, with the fullness of a perfect affection, to ease her burden. "Ma, you let me do this." "Now, Ma, I'll tend to that. You go sit down, Ma." These were the everyday expressions of the enduring affection that existed between them. Always there was perfect understanding between Jennie and her mother, and as the days passed this naturally widened and deepened. Jennie could not bear to think of her as being always confined to the house. Daily she thought as she worked of that humble home where her mother was watching and waiting. How she longed to give her those comforts which she had always craved. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The days spent in the employ of the Bracebridge household were of a broadening character. This great house was a school to Jennie, not only in the matter of dress and manners, but as formulating a theory of existence. Mrs. Bracebridge and her husband were the last word in the matter of self-sufficiency, taste in the matter of appointments, care in the matter of dress, good form in the matter of reception, entertainment, and the various usages of social life. Now and then, apropos of nothing save her own mood, Mrs. Bracebridge would indicate her philosophy of life in an epigram. Life is a battle, my dear. If you gain anything, you will have to fight for it. In my judgment, it is silly not to take advantage of any aid which will help you to be what you want to be. This while applying a faint suggestion of rouge. Most people are born silly. They are exactly what they are capable of being. I despise lack of taste. It is the worst crime. Most of these worldly wise comments were not given directly to Jennie. She overheard them, but to her quiet and reflective mind they had their import. Like seeds fallen upon good ground, they took root and grew. She began to get a faint perception of hierarchies and powers. They were not for her, perhaps, but they were in the world, and if fortune were kind, one might better one's state. She worked on, wondering, however, just how better fortune might come to her. Who would have her for a wife, knowing her history? How could she ever explain the existence of her child? Her child, the one transcendent, gripping theme of joy and fear. If she could only do something for it, sometime, somehow. For the first winter things went smoothly enough. By the closest economy, the children were clothed and kept in school, the rent paid, and the installments met. Once it looked as though there might be some difficulty about the continuance of the home life, and that was when Gerhardt wrote that he would be home for Christmas. The mill was to close down for a short period at that time. He was naturally anxious to see what the new life of his family at Cleveland was like. Mrs. Gerhardt would have welcomed his return with unalloyed pleasure had it not been for the fear she entertained of his creating a scene. Jennie talked it over with her mother, and Mrs. Gerhardt in turn spoke of it to Bass, whose advice was to brave it out. "Don't worry," he said. "He won't do anything about it. I'll talk to him if he says anything." The scene did occur, but it was not so unpleasant as Mrs. Gerhardt had feared. Gerhardt came home during the afternoon, while Bass, Jennie, and George were at work. Two of the younger children went to the train to meet him. When he entered, Mrs. Gerhardt greeted him affectionately, but she trembled for the discovery which was sure to come. Her suspense was not for long. Gerhardt opened the front bedroom door only a few minutes after he arrived. On the white counterpane of the bed was a pretty child sleeping. He could not but know on the instant whose it was, but he pretended ignorance. "Whose child is that?" he questioned. "It's Jennie's," said Mrs. Gerhardt weakly. "When did that come here?" "Not so very long ago," answered the mother nervously. "I guess she is here too," he declared contemptuously, refusing to pronounce her name, a fact which he had already anticipated. "She's working in a family," returned his wife in a pleading tone. "She's doing so well now. She had no place to go. Let her alone." Gerhardt had received a light since he had been away. Certain inexplicable thoughts and feelings had come to him in his religious meditations. In his prayers he had admitted to the All-Seeing that he might have done differently by his daughter, yet He could not make up his mind how to treat her for the future. She had committed a great sin. It was impossible to get away from that. When Jennie came home that night, a meeting was unavoidable. Gerhardt saw her coming and pretended to be deeply engaged in a newspaper. Mrs. Gerhardt, who had begged him not to ignore Jennie entirely, trembled for fear he would say or do something which would hurt her feelings. "She is coming now," she said, crossing to the door of the front room where he was sitting, but Gerhardt refused to look up. "Speak to her anyhow," was her last appeal before the door opened, but he made no reply. When Jennie came in, her mother whispered, "He's in the front room." Jennie paled, put her thumb to her lip, and stood irresolute, not knowing how to meet the situation. "Has he seen?" Jennie paused as she realized from her mother's face and nod that Gerhardt knew of the child's existence. "Go ahead," said Mrs. Gerhardt. "It's all right. He won't say anything." Jennie finally went to the door, and seeing her father, his brow wrinkled as if in serious but not unkindly thought, she hesitated but made her way forward. "Papa," she said, unable to formulate a definite sentence. Gerhardt looked up, his grayish-brown eyes a study under their heavy sandy lashes. At the sight of his daughter he weakened internally, but with the self-adjusted armor of resolve about him, he showed no sign of pleasure at seeing her. All the forces of his conventional understanding of morality and his naturally sympathetic and fatherly disposition were battling within him, but, as in so many cases where the average mind is concerned, convention was temporarily the victor. "Yes," he said. "Won't you forgive me, Papa?" "I do," he returned grimly. She hesitated a moment and then stepped forward, for what purpose he well understood. "There," he said, pushing her gently away as her lips barely touched his grizzled cheek. It had been a frigid meeting. When Jennie went out into the kitchen after this very trying ordeal, she lifted her eyes to her waiting mother and tried to make it seem as though all had been well, but her emotional disposition got the better of her. "Did he make up to you?" her mother was about to ask, but the words were only half out of her mouth before her daughter sank down into one of the chairs close to the kitchen table, and laying her head on her arm, burst forth into soft, convulsive, inaudible sobs. "Now, now," said Mrs. Gerhardt. "There now, don't cry. What did he say?" It was some time before Jennie recovered herself sufficiently to answer. Her mother tried to treat the situation lightly. "I wouldn't feel bad," she said. "He'll get over it. It's his way." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The return of Gerhardt brought forward the child's question in all its bearings. He could not help considering it from the standpoint of a grandparent, particularly since it was a human being possessed of a soul. He wondered if it had been baptized. Then he inquired. "No, not yet," said his wife, who had not forgotten this duty, but had been uncertain whether the little one would be welcome in the faith. "No, of course not," sneered Gerhardt, whose opinion of his wife's religious devotion was not any too great. "Such carelessness, such irreligion. That is a fine thing." He thought it over a few moments, and felt that this evil should be corrected at once. "It should be baptized," he said. "Why don't she take it and have it baptized?" Mrs. Gerhardt reminded him that someone would have to stand godfather to the child, and there was no way to have the ceremony performed without confessing the fact that it was without a legitimate father. Gerhardt listened to this, and it quieted him for a few moments, but his religion was something which he could not see put in the background by any such difficulty. How would the Lord look upon quibbling like this? It was not Christian, and it was his duty to attend to the matter. It must be taken forthwith to the church, Jennie, himself, and his wife accompanying it as sponsors. Or, if he did not choose to condescend thus far to his daughter, he must see that it was baptized when she was not present. He brooded over this difficulty, and finally decided that the ceremony should take place on one of these weekdays between Christmas and New Year's, when Jennie would be at her work. This proposal he broached to his wife, and receiving her approval, he made his next announcement. "It has no name," he said. Jennie and her mother had talked over this very matter, and Jennie had expressed a preference for Vesta. Now her mother made bold to suggest it as her own choice. How would Vesta do? Gerhardt heard this with indifference. Secretly, he had settled the question in his own mind. He had a name in store, left over from the halcyon period of his youth, and never opportunity available in the case of his own children. Wilhelmina. Of course, he had no idea of unbending in the least toward his small granddaughter. He merely liked the name, and the child ought to be grateful to get it. With a far-off, gingerly air, he brought forward this first offering upon the altar of natural affection. For offering it was, after all. "That is nice," he said, forgetting his indifference. "But how would Wilhelmina do?" Mrs. Gerhardt did not dare to cross him when he was thus unconsciously weakening. Her woman's tact came to the rescue. "We might give her both names," she compromised. "It makes no difference to me," he replied, drawing back into the shell of opposition from which he had been inadvertently drawn. "Just so she is baptized." Jennie heard of this with pleasure, for she was anxious that the child should have every advantage, religious or otherwise, that it was possible to obtain. She took great pains to starch and iron the clothes it was to wear on the appointed day. Gerhardt sought out the minister of the nearest Lutheran church, a round-headed, thick-set theologian of the most formal type, to whom he stated his errand. "Your grandchild?" inquired the minister. "Yes," said Gerhardt. "Her father is not here." "So," replied the minister, looking at him curiously. Gerhardt was not to be disturbed in his purpose. He explained that he and his wife would bring her. The minister, realizing the probable difficulty, did not question him further. "The church cannot refuse to baptize her so long as you, as grandparents, are willing to stand sponsor for her," he said. Gerhardt came away, hurt by the shadow of disgrace in which he felt himself involved, but satisfied that he had done his duty. Now he would take the child and have it baptized, and when that was over, his present responsibility would cease. When it came to the hour of the baptism, however, he found that another influence was working to guide him into greater interest and responsibility. The stern religion with which he was enraptured, its insistence upon a higher law, was there, and he heard again the precepts which had helped to bind him to his own children. "Is it your intention to educate this child in the knowledge and love of the gospel?" asked the black-gowned minister, as they stood before him in the silent little church whither they had brought the infant. He was reading from the form provided for such occasions. Gerhardt answered, "Yes," and Mrs. Gerhardt added her affirmative. "Do you engage to use all necessary care and diligence, by prayerful instruction, admonition, example, and discipline, that this child may renounce and avoid everything that is evil, and that she may keep God's will and commandments as declared in his sacred word?" A thought flashed through Gerhardt's mind as the words were uttered of how it had fared with his own children. They, too, had been thus sponsored. They, too, had heard his solemn pledge to care for their spiritual welfare. He was silent. "We do," prompted the minister. "We do," repeated Gerhardt and his wife weakly. "Do you now dedicate this child by the rite of baptism unto the Lord who brought it?" "We do." "And finally, if you can conscientiously declare before God that the faith to which you have assented is your faith, and that the solemn promises you have made are the serious resolutions of your heart, please to announce the same in the presence of God by saying, 'Yes.'" "Yes," they replied. "I baptize thee, Wilhelmina Vesta," concluded the minister, stretching out his hand over her, "in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Let us pray." Gerhardt bent his gray head and followed with humble reverence the beautiful invocation which followed. "Almighty and everlasting God, we adore thee as the great parent of the children of men, as the father of our spirits and the former of our bodies. We praise thee for giving existence to this infant and for preserving her until this day. We bless thee that she is called to virtue and glory, that she has now been dedicated to thee and brought within the pale of the Christian church. We thank thee that by the gospel of the Son she is furnished with everything necessary for her spiritual happiness, that it supplies light for her mind and comfort for her heart, encouragement and power to discharge her duty, and the precious hope of mercy and immortality to sustain and make her faithful. And we beseech thee, O most merciful God, that this child may be enlightened and sanctified from her early years by the Holy Spirit, and be everlastingly saved by thy mercy. Direct and bless thy servants who are entrusted with the care of her in the momentous work of her education. Inspire them with just conception of the absolute necessity of religious instruction and principles. Forbid that they should ever forget that this offspring belongs to thee, and that, if through their criminal neglect or bad example, thy reasonable creature be lost, thou wilt require it at their hands. Give them a deep sense of the divinity of her nature, of the worth of her soul, of the dangers to which she will be exposed, of the honor and felicity to which she is capable of ascending with thy blessings, and of the ruin in this world and the misery in the world to come which springs from wicked passion and conduct. Give them grace to check the first risings of forbidden inclination in her breast, to be her defense against the temptations incident to childhood and youth, and as she grows up, to enlarge her understanding and to lead her to an acquaintance with thee and with Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. Give them grace to cultivate in her heart a supreme reverence and love for thee, a grateful attachment to the gospel of thy Son, her Savior, a due regard for all its ordinances and institutions, a temper of kindness and goodwill to all mankind, and an invincible love of sincerity and truth. Help them watch continually over her with tender solicitude, to be studious, that by their conversation and deportment her heart may not be corrupted, and at all times to set before her such an example that she may safely tread in their footsteps. If it pleases thee to prolong her days on earth, grant that she may prove an honor and a comfort to her parents and friends, be useful in the world, and find in thy providence an unfailing defense and support. Whether she live, let her live to thee, or whether she die, let her die to thee. And at the great day of account, may she and her parents meet each other with rapture and rejoice together in thy redeeming love. Through Jesus Christ, forever and ever. Amen. As this solemn admonition was read, a feeling of obligation descended upon the grandfather of this little outcast, a feeling that he was bound to give the tiny creature lying on his wife's arm the care and attention which God in his sacrament had commanded. He bowed his head in utmost reverence, and when the service was concluded and they left the silent church, He was without words to express his feelings. Religion was a consuming thing with him. God was a person, a dominant reality. Religion was not a thing of mere words or of interesting ideas to be listened to on Sunday, but a strong, vital expression of the divine will handed down from a time when men were in personal contact with God. Its fulfillment was a matter of joy and salvation with him, the one consolation of a creature sent to wander in a vale whose explanation was not here but in heaven. Slowly Gerhardt walked on, and as he brooded on the words and the duties which the sacrament involved, the shade of lingering disgust that had possessed him when he had taken the child to the church disappeared, and a feeling of natural affection took its place. However much the daughter had sinned, the infant was not to blame. It was a helpless, puling, tender thing, demanding his sympathy and his love. Gerhardt felt his heart go out to the little child, and yet he could not yield his position all in a moment. "That is a nice man," he said of the minister to his wife as they walked along, rapidly softening in his conception of his duty. "Yes, he was," agreed Mrs. Gerhardt timidly. "It's a good-sized little church," he continued. "Yes." Gerhardt looked around him, at the street, the houses, the show of brisk life on this sunshiny winter's day, and then finally at the child that his wife was carrying. "She must be heavy," he said in his characteristic German. "Let me take her." Mrs. Gerhardt, who was rather weary, did not refuse. "There," he said, as he looked at her, and then fixed her comfortably upon his shoulder. "Let us hope she proves worthy of all that has been done today." Mrs. Gerhardt listened, and the meaning in his voice interpreted itself plainly enough. The presence of the child in the house might be the cause of recurring spells of depression and unkind words, but there would be another and greater influence restraining him. There would always be her soul to consider. He would never again be utterly unconscious of her soul. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. During the remainder of Gerhardt's stay he was shy in Jennie's presence and endeavored to act as though he were unconscious of her existence. When the time came for parting, he even went away without bidding her good-bye, telling his wife she might do that for him. But after he was actually on his way back to Youngstown, he regretted the omission. "I might have bade her good-bye," he thought to himself as the train rumbled heavily along. But it was too late. For the time being the affairs of the Gerhardt family drifted. Jennie continued her work with Mrs. Bracebridge. Sebastian fixed himself firmly in his clerkship in the cigar store. George was promoted to the noble sum of $3, and then $3.50. It was a narrow, humdrum life the family led. Coal, groceries, shoes, and clothing were the uppermost topics of their conversation. Everyone felt the stress and strain of trying to make ends meet. That which worried Jennie most, and there were many things which weighed upon her sensitive soul, was the outcome of her own life, not so much for herself as for her baby and the family. She could not really see where she fitted in. Who would have me, she asked herself over and over. How was she to dispose of Vesta in the event of a new love affair? Such a contingency was quite possible. She was young, good-looking, and men were inclined to flirt with her, or rather to attempt it. The Bracebridges entertained many masculine guests, and some of them had made unpleasant overtures to her. "My dear, you're a very pretty girl," said one old rake of 50-odd when she knocked at his door one morning to give him a message from his hostess. "I beg your pardon," she said confusedly, and colored. "Indeed, you're quite sweet, and you needn't beg my pardon." I'd like to talk to you sometime." He attempted to chuck her under the chin, but Jennie hurried away. She would have reported the matter to her mistress, but a nervous shame deterred her. Why would men always be doing this? She thought. Could it be because there was something innately bad about her? An inward corruption that attracted its like. It is a curious characteristic of the non-defensive disposition that it is like a honey jar to flies. Nothing is brought to it, and much is taken away. Around a soft, yielding, unselfish disposition, men swarm naturally. They sense this generosity, this non-protective attitude from afar. A girl like Jennie is like a comfortable fire to the average masculine mind. They gravitate to it, seek its sympathy, yearn to possess it. Hence she was annoyed by many unwelcome attentions. One day there arrived from Cincinnati a certain Lester Kane, the son of a wholesale carriage builder of great trade distinction in that city and elsewhere throughout the country, who was wont to visit this house frequently in a social way. He was a friend of Mrs. Bracebridge more than of her husband, for the former had been raised in Cincinnati and as a girl had visited at his father's house. She knew his mother, his brother and sisters, and to all intents and purposes socially had always been considered one of the family. "Lester's coming tomorrow, Henry," Jennie heard Mrs. Bracebridge tell her husband. "I had a wire from him this noon. He's such a scamp. I'm going to give him the big east front room upstairs. Be sociable and pay him some attention. His father was so good to me." "I know it," said her husband calmly. "I like Lester. He's the biggest one in that family. But he's too indifferent. He doesn't care enough." "I know, but he's so nice. I do think he's one of the nicest men I ever knew." "I'll be decent to him. Don't I always do pretty well by your people?" "Yes, pretty well." "Oh, I don't know about that," he replied dryly. When this notable person arrived, Jennie was prepared to see someone of more than ordinary importance, and she was not disappointed. There came into the reception hall to greet her mistress a man, perhaps 36 years of age, above the medium in height, clear-eyed, firm-jawed, athletic, direct, and vigorous. He had a deep, resonant voice that carried clearly everywhere. People somehow used to stop and listen whether they knew him or not. He was simple and abrupt in his speech. "Oh, there you are," he began. "I'm glad to see you again. How's Mr. Bracebridge? How's Fanny?" He asked his questions forcefully, wholeheartedly, and his hostess answered with an equal warmth. "I'm glad to see you, Lester," she said. "George will take your things upstairs. Come up into my room. It's more comfy. How are Grandpa and Louise?" He followed her up the stairs, and Jennie, who had been standing at the head of the stairs listening, felt the magnetic charm of his personality. It seemed, why she could hardly say, that a real personage had arrived. The house was cheerier. The attitude of her mistress was much more complacent. Everybody seemed to feel that something must be done for this man. Jennie went about her work, but the impression persisted. His name ran in her mind, Lester Kane, and he was from Cincinnati. She looked at him now and then on the sly, and felt for the first time in her life an interest in a man on his own account. He was so big, so handsome, so forceful. She wondered what his business was. At the same time, she felt a little dread of him. Once she caught him looking at her with a steady, incisive stare. She quailed inwardly and took the first opportunity to get out of his presence. Another time he tried to address a few remarks to her, but she pretended that her duties called her away. She knew that often his eyes were on her when her back was turned, and it made her nervous. She wanted to run away from him, although there was no very definite reason why she should do so. As a matter of fact, this man, so superior to Jennie in wealth, education, and social position, felt an instinctive interest in her unusual personality. Like the others, he was attracted by that peculiar softness of her disposition and her preeminent femininity. There was that about her which suggested the luxury of love. He felt as if somehow she could be reached. Why, he could not have said. She did not bear any outward marks of her previous experience. There was no evidence of coquetry about her, but still he felt that he might. He was inclined to make the venture on his first visit, but business called him away. He left after 4 days and was absent from Cleveland for 3 weeks. Jennie thought he was gone for good, and she experienced a queer sense of relief as well as of regret. Then suddenly he returned. He came apparently unexpected, explaining to Mrs. Bracebridge that business interests again demanded his presence in Cleveland. As he spoke, he looked at Jennie sharply, and she felt as if somehow his presence might also concern her a little. On this second visit she had various opportunities of seeing him: at breakfast, where she sometimes served; at dinner, when she could see the guests at the table, from the parlor or the sitting room; and at odd times when he came to Mrs. Bracebridge's boudoir to talk things over. They were very friendly. "Why don't you settle down, Lester, and get married?" Jennie heard her say to him the second day he was there. "You know it's time." "I know," he replied, "but I'm in no mood for that. I want to browse around a little while yet." "Yes, I know about your browsing. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Your father is really worried." He chuckled amusedly. "Father doesn't worry much about me. He's got all he can attend to look after the business." Jennie looked at him curiously. She scarcely understood what she was thinking, but this man drew her. If she had realized in what way, she would have fled his presence then and there. Now he was more insistent in his observation of her, addressed an occasional remark to her, engaged her in brief, magnetic conversations. She could not help answering him. He was pleasing to her. Once he came across her in the hall on the second floor, searching in a locker for some linen. They were all alone, Mrs. Bracebridge having gone out to do some morning shopping, and the other servants being below stairs. On this occasion he made short work of the business. He approached her in a commanding, unhesitating, and thoroughly determined way. "I want to talk to you," he said. "Where do you live?" I, she stammered, and blanched perceptibly. "I live on Laurie Street." "What number?" he questioned, as though she were compelled to tell him. She quailed and shook inwardly. 1314, she replied mechanically. He looked into her big, soft blue eyes with his dark, vigorous brown ones. A flash that was hypnotic, significant, insistent passed between them. "You belong to me," he said. "I've been looking for you. When can I see you?" "Oh, you mustn't," she said, her fingers going nervously to her lips. "I can't see you. I—" "Oh, I mustn't, mustn't I? Look here." He took her arm and drew her slightly closer. "You and I might as well understand each other right now. I like you. Do you like me? Say." She looked at him, her eyes wide, filled with wonder, with fear, with a growing terror. "I don't know," she gasped, her lips dry. "Do you?" He fixed her grimly, firmly with his eyes. "I don't know." "Look at me," he said. "Yes," she replied. He pulled her to him quickly. "I'll talk to you later," he said, and put his lips masterfully to hers. She was horrified, stunned, like a bird in the grasp of a cat. But through it all something tremendously vital and insistent was speaking to her. He released her with a short laugh. "We won't do any more of this here, but remember, you belong to me," he said, as he turned and walked nonchalantly down the hall. Jennie, in sheer panic, ran to her mistress's room and locked the door behind her. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The shock of this sudden encounter was so great to Jennie that she was hours in recovering herself. At first she did not understand clearly just what had happened. Out of clear sky, as it were, this astonishing thing had taken place. She had yielded herself to another man. Why? Why? She asked herself, and yet within her own consciousness there was an answer. Though she could not explain her own emotions, she belonged to him temperamentally, and he belonged to her. There is a fate in love and a fate in fight. This strong intellectual bear of a man, son of a wealthy manufacturer, stationed, so far as material conditions were concerned, in a world immensely superior to that in which Jennie moved, was nevertheless instinctively, magnetically, and chemically drawn to this poor serving maid. She was his natural affinity, though he did not know it, the one woman who answered somehow the biggest need of his nature. Lester Kane had known all sorts of women, rich and poor, the highly bred maidens of his own class, the daughters of the proletariat, but he had never found one who seemed to combine for him the traits of an ideal woman: sympathy, kindliness of judgment, youth, and beauty. Yet this ideal remained fixedly seated in the back of his brain. When the right woman appeared, he intended to take her. He had the notion that, for purposes of marriage, he ought to find this woman on his own plane. For purposes of temporary happiness, he might take her from anywhere, leaving marriage, of course, out of the question. He had no idea of making anything like a serious proposal to a servant girl. But Jennie was different. He had never seen a servant quite like her. And she was ladylike and lovely without appearing to know it. Why, this girl was a rare flower. Why shouldn't he try to seize her? Let us be just to Lester Kane. Let us try to understand him and his position. Not every mind is to be estimated by the weight of a single folly. Not every personality is to be judged by the drag of a single passion. We live in an age in which the impact of materialized forces is well nigh irresistible. The spiritual nature is overwhelmed by the shock. The tremendous and complicated development of our material civilization, the multiplicity and variety of our social forms, the depth, subtlety, and sophistry of our imaginative impressions, gathered, remultiplied, and disseminated by such agencies as the railroad, the express, and the post office, the telephone, the telegraph, the newspaper, and, in short, the whole machinery of social intercourse, these elements of existence combine to produce what may be termed a kaleidoscopic glitter, a dazzling and confusing phantasmagoria of life that wearies and stultifies the mental and moral nature. It induces a sort of intellectual fatigue through which we see the ranks of the victims of insomnia, melancholia, and insanity constantly recruited. Our modern brain pan does not seem capable as yet of receiving, sorting, and storing the vast army of facts and impressions which present themselves daily. The white light of publicity is too white. We are weighed upon by too many things. It is as if the wisdom of the infinite were struggling to beat itself into finite and cup-big minds. Lester Kane was the natural product of these untoward conditions. His was a naturally observing mind, Rabelaisian in its strength and tendencies, but confused by the multiplicity of things, the vastness of the panorama of life, the glitter of its details, the unsubstantial nature of its forms, the uncertainty of their justification. Born a Catholic, he was no longer a believer in the divine inspiration of Catholicism. Raised a member of the social elect, he had ceased to accept the fetish that birth and station presuppose any innate superiority. Brought up as the heir to a comfortable fortune and expected to marry in his own sphere, he was by no means sure that he wanted marriage on any terms. Of course the conjugal state was an institution. It was established. Yes, certainly. But what of it? The whole nation believed in it. True, but other nations believed in polygamy. There were other questions that bothered him, such questions as the belief in a single deity or ruler of the universe, and whether a republican, monarchical, or aristocratic form of government were best. In short, the whole body of things, material, social, and spiritual, had come under the knife of his mental surgery and had been left but half dissected. Life was not proven to him. Not a single idea of his, unless it were the need of being honest, was finally settled. In all other things he wavered, questioned, procrastinated, leaving to time and to the powers back of the universe the solution of problems that vexed him. Yes, Lester Kane was the natural product of a combination of elements, religious, commercial, social, modified by that pervading atmosphere of liberty in our national life which is productive of almost uncounted freedom of thought and action. 36 years of age, and apparently a man of vigorous, aggressive, and sound personality, he was nevertheless an essentially animal man, pleasantly veneered by education and environment. Like the hundreds of thousands of Irishmen who in his father's day had worked on the railroad tracks, dug in the mines, picked and shoveled in the ditches, and carried up bricks and mortar on the endless structures of a new land, he was strong, hairy, axiomatic, and witty. "Do you want me to come back here next year?" he had asked of Brother Ambrose when, in his 17th year, that ecclesiastical member was about to chastise him for some schoolboy misdemeanor. The other stared at him in astonishment. "Your father will have to look after that," he replied. "Well, my father won't look after it," Lester returned. "If you touch me with that whip, I'll take things into my own hands. I am not committing any punishable offenses, and I am not going to be knocked around any more." Words, unfortunately, did not avail in this case, but a good, vigorous Irish-American wrestle did, in which the whip was broken and the discipline of the school so far impaired that he was compelled to take his clothes and leave. After that, he looked his father in the eye and told him that he was not going to school any more. "I am perfectly willing to jump in and work," he explained. "There's nothing in a classical education for me. Let me go into the office, and I guess I'll pick up enough to carry me through." Old Archibald Kane, keen, single-minded, of unsullied commercial honor, admired his son's determination, and did not attempt to coerce him. "Come down to the office," he said. "Perhaps there is something you can do." Entering upon a business life at the age of 18, Lester had worked faithfully, rising in his father's estimation until now he had come to be, in a way, his personal representative. Whenever there was a contract to be entered upon, an important move to be decided, or a representative of the manufactory to be sent anywhere to consummate a deal, Lester was the agent selected. His father trusted him implicitly, and so diplomatic and earnest was he in the fulfillment of his duties that this trust had never been impaired. "Business is business" was a favorite axiom with him, and the very tone in which he pronounced the words was a reflex of his character and personality. There were molten forces in him, flames which burst forth now and then in spite of the fact that he was sure that he had them under control. One of these impulses was a taste for liquor, of which he was perfectly sure he had the upper hand. He drank but very little, he thought, and only in a social way among friends, never to excess. Another weakness lay in his sensual nature, but here again he believed that he was the master. If he chose to have irregular relations with women, he was capable of deciding where the danger point lay. If men were only guided by a sense of the brevity inherent in all such relationships, there would not be so many troublesome consequences growing out of them. Finally, he flattered himself that he had a grasp upon a right method of living, a method which was nothing more than a quiet acceptance of social conditions as they were, tempered by a little personal judgment as to the right and wrong of individual conduct. Not to fuss and fume, not to cry out about anything, not to be mawkishly sentimental, to be vigorous and sustain your personality intact. Such was his theory of life, and he was satisfied that it was a good one. As to Jennie, his original object in approaching her had been purely selfish, but now that he had asserted his masculine prerogatives and she had yielded, at least in part, he began to realize that she was no common girl, no toy of the passing hour. There is a time in some men's lives when they unconsciously begin to view feminine youth and beauty not so much in relation to the ideal of happiness, but rather with regard to the social conventions by which they are environed. Must it be, they ask themselves, in speculating concerning the possibility of taking a maiden to wife, that I shall be compelled to swallow the whole social code, make a covenant with society, sign a pledge of abstinence, and give to another a life interest in all my affairs, when I know too well that I am but taking to my arms a variable creature like myself, whose wishes are apt to become insistent and burdensome in proportion to the decrease of her beauty and interest. These are men who, unwilling to risk the manifold contingencies of an authorized connection, are led to consider the advantages of a less binding union, a temporary companionship. They seek to seize the happiness of life without paying the cost of their indulgence. Later on, they think, the more definite and conventional relationship may be established without reproach or the necessity of radical readjustment. Lester Kane was past the youthful love period, and he knew it. The innocence and unsophistication of younger ideals had gone. He wanted the comfort of feminine companionship, but he was more and more disinclined to give up his personal liberty in order to obtain it. He would not wear the social shackles if it were possible to satisfy the needs of his heart and nature and still remain free and unfettered. Of course, he must find the right woman, and in Jennie he believed that he had discovered her. She appealed to him on every side. He had never known anybody quite like her. Marriage was not only impossible but unnecessary. He had only to say "come," and she must obey. It was her destiny. Lester thought the matter over calmly, dispassionately. He strolled out to the shabby street where she lived, looked at the humble roof that sheltered her. Her poverty, her narrow and straitened environment touched his heart. Ought he not to treat her generously, fairly, honorably? Then the remembrance of her marvelous beauty swept over him and changed his mood. No, he must possess her if he could, today, quickly, as soon as possible. It was in that frame of mind that he returned to Mrs. Bracebridge's home from his visit to Laurie Street. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Jennie was now going through the agony of one who has a varied and complicated problem to confront. Her baby, her father, her brothers and sisters all rose up to confront her. What was this thing she was doing? Was she allowing herself to slip into another wretched, unsanctified relationship? How was she to explain to her family about this man? He would not marry her, that was sure, if he knew all about her. He would not marry her anyhow, a man of his station and position. Yet here she was, parleying with him. What ought she to do? She pondered over the problem until evening, deciding first that it was best to run away, but remembering painfully that she had told him where she lived. Then she resolved that she would summon up her courage and refuse him, tell him she wouldn't have anything to do with him. This last solution of the difficulty seemed simple enough in his absence, and she would find work where he could not follow her up so easily. It all seemed simple enough as she put on her things in the evening to go home. Her aggressive lover, however, was not without his own conclusion in this matter. Since leaving Jennie he had thought concisely and to the point. He came to the decision that he must act at once. She might tell her family, she might tell Mrs. Bracebridge, she might leave the city. He wanted to know more of the conditions which surrounded her, and there was only one way to do that. Talk to her. He must persuade her to come and live with him. She would, he thought. She admitted that she liked him. That soft, yielding note in her character which had originally attracted him seemed to presage that he could win her without much difficulty if he wished to try. He decided to do so, anyhow, for truly he desired her greatly. At 5:30 he returned to the Bracebridge home to see if she were still there. At 6 he had an opportunity to say to her unobserved, "I am going to walk home with you. Wait for me at the next corner, will you?" "Yes," she said, a sense of compulsion to do his bidding seizing her. She explained to herself afterward that she ought to talk to him, that she must tell him finally of her decision not to see him again, and this was as good an opportunity as any. At 6:30 he left the house on a pretext, a forgotten engagement, and a little after 7 he was waiting for her in a closed carriage near the appointed spot. He was calm, absolutely satisfied as to the result, and curiously elated beneath a sturdy, shock-proof exterior. It was as if he breathed some fragrant perfume, soft, grateful, entrancing. A few minutes after 8 he saw Jennie coming along. The flare of the gas lamp was not strong, but it gave sufficient light for his eyes to make her out. A wave of sympathy passed over him, for there was a great appeal in her personality. He stepped out as she neared the corner and confronted her. "Come," he said, "and get into this carriage with me. I'll take you home." "No," she replied, "I don't think I ought to." "Come with me. I'll take you home. It's a better way to talk." Once more that sense of dominance on his part, that power of compulsion. She yielded, feeling all the time that she should not. He called out to the cabman, "Anywhere for a little while." When she was seated beside him, he began at once. "Listen to me, Jennie. I want you. Tell me something about yourself." "I have to talk to you," she replied, trying to stick to her original line of defense. "About what?" he inquired, seeking to fathom her expression in the half light. "I can't go on this way," she murmured nervously. "I can't act this way. You don't know how it all is. I shouldn't have done what I did this morning. I mustn't see you any more. Really, I mustn't." "You didn't do what you did this morning," he remarked paradoxically, seizing on that one particular expression. "I did that. And as for seeing me any more, I'm going to see you." He seized her hand. "You don't know me, but I like you. I'm crazy about you, that's all. You belong to me. Now listen. I'm going to have you. Are you going to come to me?" "No, no, no," she replied in an agonized voice. "I can't do anything like that, Mr. Kane. Please listen to me. It can't be. You don't know. Oh, you don't know. I can't do what you want. I don't want to. I couldn't even if I wanted to. You don't know how things are. But I don't want to do anything wrong. I mustn't. I can't. I won't. Oh, no, no, no. Please let me go home." He listened to this troubled, feverish outburst with sympathy, with even a little pity. "What do you mean by you can't?" he asked curiously. "Oh, I can't tell you," she replied. "Please don't ask me. You oughtn't to know. But I mustn't see you any more. It won't do any good." "But you like me," he retorted. "Oh, yes, yes, I do. I can't help that. But you mustn't come near me any more. Please don't." He turned his proposition over in his mind with the solemnity of a judge. He knew that this girl liked him, loved him really, brief as their contact had been, and he was drawn to her, perhaps not irrevocably, but with exceeding strength. What prevented her from yielding, especially since she wanted to? He was curious. "See here, Jennie," he replied, "I hear what you say. I don't know what you mean by can't if you want to. You say you like me. Why can't you come to me? You're my sort. We'll get along beautifully together. You're suited to me, temperamentally. I'd like to have you with me. What makes you say you can't come?" "I can't," she replied. "I can't. I don't want to. I oughtn't. Oh, please don't ask me any more. You don't know. I can't tell you why." She was thinking of her baby. The man had a keen sense of justice and fair play. Above all things, he wanted to be decent in his treatment of people. In this case he intended to be tender and considerate, and yet he must win her. He turned this over in his mind. "Listen to me," he said finally, still holding her hand. "I may not want you to do anything immediately. I want you to think it over. But you belong to me. You say you care for me. You admitted that this morning. I know you do. Now, why should you stand out against me? I like you, and I can do a lot of things for you. Why not let us be good friends now? Then we can talk the rest of this over later." "But I mustn't do anything wrong," she insisted. "I don't want to. Please don't come near me any more. I can't do what you want." "Now look here," he said. "You don't mean that. Why did you say you liked me? Have you changed your mind? Look at me." She had lowered her eyes. "Look at me. You haven't, have you?" "Oh, no, no, no," she half sobbed, swept by some force beyond her control. "Well, then, why stand out against me? I love you, I tell you. I'm crazy about you. That's why I came back this time. It was to see you." "Was it?" asked Jennie, surprised. "Yes, it was, and I would have come again and again if necessary. I tell you, I'm crazy about you. I've got to have you. Now, tell me you'll come with me." "No, no, no," she pleaded. "I can't. I must work. I want to work. I don't want to do anything wrong. Please don't ask me. You mustn't. You must let me go. Really, you must. I can't do what you want." "Tell me, Jennie," he said, changing the subject. "What does your father do?" "He's a glass blower." "Here in Cleveland?" "No, he works in Youngstown." "Is your mother alive?" "Yes, sir." "You live with her?" "Yes, sir." He smiled at the "sir." "Don't say 'sir' to me, sweet," he pleaded in his gruff way. "And don't insist on the Mr. Kane. I'm not Mister to you any more. You belong to me, little girl, me." And he pulled her close to him. "Please don't, Mr. Kane," she pleaded. "Oh, please don't. I can't. I can't. You mustn't." But he sealed her lips with his own. "Listen to me, Jennie," he repeated, using his favorite expression. "I tell you, you belong to me. I like you better every moment. I haven't had a chance to know you. I'm not going to give you up. You've got to come to me eventually, and I'm not going to have you working as a lady's maid. You can't stay in that place except for a little while. I'm going to take you somewhere else. And I'm going to leave you some money. Do you hear? You have to take it." At the word money she quailed and withdrew her hand. "No, no, no," she repeated. "No, I won't take it." "Yes, you will. Give it to your mother. I'm not trying to buy you. I know what you think, but I'm not. I want to help you. I want to help your family. I know where you live. I saw the place today. How many are there of you?" "6," she answered faintly. "The families of the poor," he thought. "Well, you take this from me," he insisted, drawing a purse from his coat, "and I'll see you very soon again. There's no escape, sweet." "No, no," she protested. "I won't. I don't need it. No, you mustn't ask me." He insisted further, but she was firm, and finally he put the money away. "One thing is sure, Jennie, you're not going to escape me," he said soberly. "You'll have to come to me eventually. Don't you know you will? Your own attitude shows that. I'm not going to leave you alone." "Oh, if you only knew the trouble you were causing me." "I'm not causing you any real trouble, am I?" he asked. "Surely not." "Yes. I can never do what you want." "You will, you will!" he exclaimed eagerly. The bare thought of this prize escaping him heightened his passion. "You'll come to me," and he drew her close in spite of all her protests. "There," he said, when, after the struggle, that mystic something between them spoke again, and she relaxed. Tears were in her eyes, but he did not see them. "Don't you see how it is? You like me too." "I can't," she repeated with a sob. Her evident distress touched him. "You're not crying, little girl, are you?" he asked. She made no answer. "I'm sorry," he went on. "I'll not say anything more tonight. We're almost at your home. I'm leaving tomorrow, but I'll see you again. Yes, I will, sweet. I can't give you up now. I'll do anything in reason to make it easy for you, but I can't. Do you hear?" She shook her head. "Here's where you get out," he said, as the carriage drew up near the corner. He could see the evening lamp gleaming behind the Gerhardt cottage curtains. "Good by," he said as she stepped out. "Good by," she murmured. "Remember," he said, "this is just the beginning." "Oh, no, no," she pleaded. He looked after her as she walked away. "The beauty!" he exclaimed. Jennie stepped into the house weary, discouraged, ashamed. What had she done? There was no denying that she had compromised herself irretrievably. He would come back. He would come back, and he had offered her money. That was the worst of all. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The inconclusive nature of this interview, exciting as it was, did not leave any doubt in either Lester Kane's or Jennie's mind. Certainly this was not the end of the affair. Kane knew that he was deeply fascinated. This girl was lovely. She was sweeter than he had had any idea of. Her hesitancy, her repeated protests, her gentle "no, no, no," moved him as music might. Depend upon it, this girl was for him, and he would get her. She was too sweet to let go. What did he care about what his family or what the world might think? It was curious that Kane held the well-founded idea that in time Jennie would yield to him physically, as she had already done spiritually. Just why, he could not say. Something about her, a warm womanhood, a guileless expression of countenance, intimated a sympathy toward sex relationship which had nothing to do with hard, brutal immorality. She was a kind of woman who was made for a man, one man. All her attitude toward sex was bound up with love, tenderness, service. When the one man arrived, she would love him, and she would go to him. That was Jennie as Lester understood her. He felt it. She would yield to him because he was the one man. On Jennie's part there was a great sense of complication and of possible disaster. If he followed her, of course he would learn all. She had not told him about Brander because she was still under the vague illusion that in the end she might escape. When she left him she knew that he would come back. She knew in spite of herself that she wanted him to do so. Yet she felt that she must not yield. She must go on leading her straightened, humdrum life. This was her punishment for having made a mistake. She had made her bed, and she must lie on it. The Kane family mansion at Cincinnati, to which Lester returned after leaving Jennie, was an imposing establishment, which contrasted strangely with the Gerhardt home. It was a great, rambling, two-story affair, done after the manner of the French chateau, but in red brick and brownstone. It was set down among flowers and trees in an almost park-like enclosure, and its very stones spoke of a splendid dignity and of a refined luxury. Old Archibald Kane, the father, had amassed a tremendous fortune, not by grabbing and browbeating and unfair methods, but by seeing a big need and filling it. Early in his life he had realized that America was a growing country. There was going to be a big demand for vehicles, wagons, carriages, drays, and he knew that someone would have to supply them. Having founded a small wagon industry, he had built it up into a great business. He made good wagons, and he sold them at a good profit. It was his theory that most men were honest. He believed that at bottom they wanted honest things, and if you gave them these, they would buy of you and come back and buy again and again, until you were an influential and rich man. He believed in the measure, heaped full and running over. All through his life, and now in his old age, he enjoyed the respect and approval of everyone who knew him. Archibald Kane, you would hear his competitors say, "Ah, there's a fine man, shrewd but honest. He's a big man." This man was the father of 2 sons and 3 daughters, all healthy, all good-looking, all blessed with exceptional minds, but none of them so generous and forceful as their long-living and big-hearted sire. Robert, the eldest, a man 40 years of age, was his father's right-hand man in financial matters, having a certain hard incisiveness which fitted him for the somewhat sordid details of business life. He was of medium height, of a rather spare build, with a high forehead, slightly inclined to baldness, bright liquid blue eyes, an eagle nose, and thin, firm, even lips. He was a man of few words, rather slow to action and deep of thought. He sat close to his father as vice president of the big company which occupied 2 whole blocks in an outlying section of the city. He was a strong man, a coming man, as his father well knew. Lester, the second boy, was his father's favorite. He was not by any means the financier that Robert was, but he had a larger vision of the subtleties that underlie life. He was softer, more human, more good-natured about everything, and, strangely enough, old Archibald admired and trusted him. He knew he had the bigger vision. Perhaps he turned to Robert when it was a question of some intricate financial problem, but Lester was the most loved as a son. Then there was Amy, 32 years of age, married, handsome, the mother of 1 child, a boy. Imogene, 28, also married, but as yet without children, and Louise, 25, single, the best looking of the girls, but also the coldest and most critical. She was the most eager of all for social distinction, the most vigorous of all in her love of family prestige, the most desirous that the Kane family should outshine every other. She was proud to think that the family was so well placed socially and carried herself with an air and a hauteur which was sometimes amusing, sometimes irritating to Lester. He liked her. In a way, she was his favorite sister, but he thought she might take herself with a little less seriousness and not do the family standing any harm. Mrs. Kane, the mother, was a quiet, refined woman, 60 years of age, who, having come up from comparative poverty with her husband, cared but little for social life. But she loved her children and her husband, and was naively proud of their position and attainments. It was enough for her to shine only in their reflected glory, a good woman, a good wife, and a good mother. Lester arrived at Cincinnati early in the evening and drove at once to his home. An old Irish servitor met him at the door. "Ah, Mr. Lester," he began joyously. "Sure, I'm glad to see you back. I'll take your coat. Yes, yes. It's been fine weather we're having. Yes, yes. The family's all well. Sure, your sister Amy is just after leaving the house with the boy. Your mother's upstairs in her room. Yes, yes." Lester smiled cheerily and went up to his mother's room. In this, which was done in white and gold, overlooked the garden to the south and east, sat Mrs. Kane, a subdued, graceful, quiet woman with smoothly laid gray hair. She looked up when the door opened and laid down the volume she had been reading and rose to greet him. "There you are, Mother," he said, putting his arms around her and kissing her. "How are you?" "Oh, I'm just about the same, Lester. How have you been?" "Fine. I was up with the Bracebridges for a few days again. I had to stop off in Cleveland to see Parsons. They all asked after you." "How is Minnie?" "Just the same. She doesn't change any that I can see. She's just as interested in entertaining as she ever was." "She's a bright girl," remarked his mother, recalling Mrs. Bracebridge as a girl in Cincinnati. "I always liked her. She's so sensible." "She hasn't lost any of that, I can tell you," replied Lester significantly. Mrs. Kane smiled and went on to speak of various family happenings. Imogene's husband was leaving for St. Louis on some errand. Robert's wife was sick with a cold. Old Swingle, the yard watchman at the factory, who had been with Mr. Kane for over 40 years, had died. Her husband was going to the funeral. Lester listened dutifully, albeit a trifle absently. Lester, as he walked down the hall, encountered Louise. Smart was the word for her. She was dressed in a beaded black silk dress, fitting close to her form, with a burst of rubies at her throat, which contrasted effectively with her dark complexion and black hair. Her eyes were black and piercing. "Oh, there you are, Lester!" she exclaimed. "When did you get in? Be careful how you kiss me. I'm going out, and I'm all fixed up, even to the powder on my nose. Oh, you bear!" Lester had gripped her firmly and kissed her soundly. She pushed him away with her strong hands. "I didn't brush much of it off," he said. "You can always dust more on with that puff of yours." He passed on to his own room to dress for dinner. Dressing for dinner was a custom that had been adopted by the Kane family in the last few years. Guests had become so common that in a way it was a necessity, and Louise, in particular, made a point of it. Tonight Robert was coming, and Mr. and Mrs. Burnett, old friends of his father and mother, and so, of course, the meal would be a formal one. Lester knew that his father was around somewhere, but he did not trouble to look him up now. He was thinking of his last 2 days in Cleveland and wondering when he would see Jennie again. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Jennie Gerhardt by Theodore DREISER. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As Lester came downstairs after making his toilet, he found his father in the library reading. "Hello, Lester," he said, looking up from his paper over the top of his glasses and extending his hand. "Where do you come from?" "Cleveland," replied his son, shaking hands heartily and smiling. "Robert tells me you've been to New York." "Yes, I was there." "How did you find my old friend Arnold?" "Just about the same," returned Lester. "He doesn't look any older." "I suppose not," said Archibald Kane genially, as if the report were a compliment to his own hardy condition. "He's been a temperate man, a fine old gentleman." He led the way back to the sitting room, where they chatted over business and home news until the chime of the clock in the hall warned the guest upstairs that dinner had been served. Lester sat down in great comfort amid the splendor of the great Louis Quinze dining room. He liked this homey home atmosphere, his mother and father and his sisters, the old family friends. So he smiled and was exceedingly genial. Louise announced that the Leverings were going to give a dance on Tuesday, and inquired whether he intended to go. "You know I don't dance," he returned dryly. "Why should I go?" "Don't dance? Won't dance, you mean. You're getting too lazy to move. If Robert is willing to dance occasionally, I think you might." "Robert's got it on me in lightness," Lester replied airily. "And politeness," retorted Louise. "Be that as it may," said Lester. "Don't try to stir up a fight, Louise," observed Robert sagely. After dinner they adjourned to the library, and Robert talked with his brother a little on business. There were some contracts coming up for revision. He wanted to see what suggestions Lester had to make. Louise was going to a party, and the carriage was now announced. "So you are not coming?" she asked, a trifle complainingly. "Too tired," said Lester lightly. "Make my excuses to Mrs. Knowles." "Letty Pace asked about you the other night," Louise called back from the door. "Kind," replied Lester. "I'm greatly obliged." "She's a nice girl, Lester," put in his father, who was standing near the open fire. "I only wish you'd marry her and settle down. You'd have a good wife in her." "She's charming," testified Mrs. Kane. "What is this?" asked Lester jocularly. "A conspiracy? You know I'm not strong on the matrimonial business." "And I well know it," replied his mother semi-seriously. "I wish you were." Lester changed the subject. He really could not stand for this sort of thing any more, he told himself. And as he thought, his mind wandered back to Jennie and her peculiar "oh, no, no." There was someone who appealed to him. That was a type of womanhood worth while. Not sophisticated, not self-seeking, not watched over and set like a man-trap in the path of men, but a sweet little girl, sweet as a flower, who was without anybody apparently to watch over her. That night in his room he composed a letter which he dated a week later, because he did not want to appear too urgent, and because he could not again leave Cincinnati for at least 2 weeks. My dear Jennie, although it has been a week and I have said nothing, I have not forgotten you, believe me. Was the impression I gave of myself very bad? I will make it better from now on, for I love you, little girl, I really do. There is a flower on my table which reminds me of you very much, white, delicate, beautiful. Your personality, lingering with me, is just that. You are the essence of everything beautiful to me. It is in your power to strew flowers in my path, if you will. But what I want to say here is that I shall be in Cleveland on the 18th, and I shall expect to see you. I arrive Thursday night, and I want you to meet me in the ladies' parlor of the Dornton at noon Friday. Will you? You can lunch with me. You see, I respect your suggestion that I should not call. I will not on condition. These separations are dangerous to good friendship. Write me that you will. I throw myself on your generosity, but I can't take no for an answer. Not now. With a world of affection, Lester Kane. He sealed the letter and addressed it. She's a remarkable girl in her way, he thought. She really is. End of chapter 20.